on the road. So this is a very important topic, in my opinion. It's a wonderful choice. And before I begin, just want to say that I'm not going to focus only on cataract care because I feel optometrist's role in eye care is much larger than just cataract care. So to begin with, let's go back and see who are we. We are, at the end of the day, eye care professionals, and our job is to give the eye health or people with eye health disorders some good vision. That is the first thing they will want. Then they will want vision in quantity and quality. So before we go back to seeing what is the vision that we give, let us go back and review certain very basic things for which we are constantly working against, which is blindness. Now, I don't know if you are all aware, but there are various definitions of blindness. One is clinical, which is the commonest definition we all know and we theoretically read, which is the clinical definition is the better eye with the best correction sees less than 3 meters. Legally, we view it as a larger picture, that is the state subject, that is when blindness is in such large numbers that it needs welfare measures. Economically, it has been analyzed that the larger the blindness levels in a state, in a society, in a community, the more is the economic hardship faced by the society. Then the two common words that we always use, preventable and avoidable blindness, that is, what is the blindness which is getting induced in the society, which with measures, with treatment, with interventions, we can actually reverse and make our society a more healthy society. Surprisingly, if we look at it, we see that more than 80% of the blindness is avoidable because it is treatable, which means if we should act on it, we will be able to alleviate the patient or the person from blindness and the misery associated with blindness. So the important thing, why I'm bringing in this very basic things, probably most of you have already read about it or many of us have already discussed about it, is that just to bring in the importance of the profession that you as optometrists and we as ophthalmologists, together we as eye care professionals are delivering. So there is so much importance that we play, not just reversing the blindness in a patient, not just giving a pair of glasses, but by reducing visual impairment and blindness, we are actually contributing to the progress of a society at large and changing the quality of life at large. So it's very important that we understand the level of professionalism with which we should conduct ourselves. So I'm beginning with that. Burden of blindness, we are all aware of the burden of blindness that this country faces. And just to put it in numbers, 8.8 million people are blind. The second important thing, ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, I wish to profusely thank Dr. Krishna Kumar and Mr. Mahalingam. Both of them are very dear friends of mine and we have worked as a team.
Sorry, actually, I don't know.
The eye health or people with eye health disorders, vision, that is the first thing they will want. You are all aware, but there are various definitions of blindness. One is clinical, which is the common. Surprisingly, if we look at it, we see that more than 80% of the blindness is avoidable.
Is repeating, and Dr. Ayer also already in our online now.
See numbers delivered, we can very easily understand that most of the blindness related or activities have been done more by the NGOs than the state. That means than the government, which means the government needs the help of the NGOs. So why I brought up this point here is that I want each one of you to realize that all of us, whether we are in the government or in the private sector, have to contribute our professional work towards alleviating blindness or removing blindness or decreasing the percentage and prevalence of blindness in the society at large. We have a commitment to society when we enter this profession. So coming back to the basic question is, what are the commonest causes of blindness? Needless to say, it is refractive errors, cataract, glaucoma. Now there is a new entity which has come in as a big blindness issue we are facing, that is diabetic retinopathy. There is no pride in saying that we are the diabetic capital of the world. More within the country, the south has got more number of diabetics, and we now know that whether rural or urban, the prevalence of diabetic retinopathy is more than 17%, is between 17 and 18%. In the past, we had a belief that the diabetic retinopathy was more in the urban people, but today we know it's equal between urban and rural. Diabetic retinopathy is an important cause in our country for blindness. The other causes being corneal opacity and age-related macular degeneration. So keep in mind that in spite of all the big and great work we have all been doing in this country over the years, our blindness prevalence still remains the same. There is the commonest cause of visual impairment is refractive errors. Commonest cause of avoidable blindness is cataract in this country. So I just want to come back to saying that the Vision 2020, the Right to Sight India, which is an offshoot of a collection of NGOs working in the country, along with the government, had formed a forum to find out what are the best ways of addressing the blindness issues. And then we realized that camps, we were doing a large number of camps to screen and bring in people. But then we realized that setting up vision centers is probably a better way of addressing blindness because screening and reach is better. And we are a part of the society or the community when we are present within the community, when we have a vision center there. And we are a link between the base hospital and the common man when we are having a vision center, rather than just going as a one-time event for conducting a camp in a particular location. I hope you understand the context in which I'm saying this. The second important thing we must realize is that we had certain targets for 2020. The year 2020 just passed away. It passed away with a lot of things which happened unexpectedly, like the pandemic happening. But we had, for blindness control, we had certain targets that was to bring down the prevalence of blindness in our country to 0.3%. We have done a lot of good work and we have brought down the prevalence of blindness significantly over the years. But there has been a study called the RAAB study or the RAB6 study, which shows that though we have done a lot of work, the prevalence is still quite high and we still need to do a lot of work to bring down the prevalence of blindness in our society as a whole. Again, why I'm bringing these points here is that optometrists, ophthalmologists, and the entire team of eye care professionals or eye care delivery people have to work towards this goal. So then what forms the eye care team? So it's teamwork which will bring down blindness. Ophthalmologists, optometrists, ophthalmic nurses, ophthalmic assistants, social workers, administrators. We are all like spokes in a wheel who, if we function properly together as a team, then we can run the wheel forward and achieve our target of bringing down blindness and individually taking care of the patients who have a visual problem. So I just want to quote one article from a Community Eye Health Journal, which was published in 2012, wherein the LVPEI Hyderabad, the institute, had proposed that for every 10 lakh population, we have one ophthalmologist and 4 optometrists. And there was the breakup of other eye care workers who will work as a team. I'm bringing in to show that this is teamwork which can achieve and not any one individual who can achieve. So coming now to the point of what is the role of an optometrist, not just in the larger picture, but let us now look at from the smaller picture of an eye clinic or a vision center or an eye camp. What is it that an optometrist does or should do to achieve the good results? Foremost thing is the optometrist is always the first point of contact for a patient in an eye delivery system. So the history taking is the most important, and you must be abreast with all the manner in which a doctor will take the history, which means one, you take the history in the patient's language, you ask for the chief complaints, you ask for the past history, you ask for medical history and systemic history. There is a common belief amongst the public that the eyes have to be seen away from the systemic complaints. There are many patients who will say, I will take care of my diabetes, or you don't need to worry whether I'm a diabetic or not. You take care of my eyes. We have to tell them that there are n number of health conditions which can affect the eye. Many medications for the health conditions in turn can affect the eye. Commonest being diabetes, tuberculosis, rheumatoid arthritis. These are all conditions which can affect the eye. These are all conditions, the medications of which can affect the eye. So it's very important that the patient commits to us all the details that we wish to know, and we must be very clear and have a list of details which we will ask from every patient whom we will see. The history taking is the first thing of paramount importance. Second thing is visual status, proper recording of the vision, each individual eye for distance and near. In today's world, we must remember that recording intermediate vision is probably also becoming important. Or if I may add at this point, I want to stress on every optometrist that when you do the refraction, you check for distance. When you put the near addition power, you check for near. But you all should first ask the patient, what is your profession? If your profession is something that you will sit in front of a desktop, that person expects good intermediate vision. So I want you to place the power in the trial frame based on intermediate distance and not just near distance. So do not do your work blindly, but do your work based on the need of the person who's coming.
மியூட் பண்ணதால அவரோட வாய்ஸ் போயிடுச்சு. சொல்லு, அன்மியூட் பண்ண சொல்லு. மைக் ஆன் பண்ண சொல்லு. கைண்ட்லி அன்மியூட்னு சொல்லு.
Dr. KK, kindly unmute yourself, otherwise the video is gone. Dr. KK? Dr. KK? Dr. KK? Hello, Mahalinga. Hello, yes. ஆமாங்க மேடம், இட்ஸ் கோயிங் ஆன் நவ். 6க்குள்ளே பண்ணணும் மேடம். 5:45 6 தான் லாகின் டைம்.
Sorry, actually there was some.
அது 5:45 உங்களுக்கு எல்லா மெசேஜ் வந்துருக்குமே. பே பண்ணால் நான் என்ன பண்ணுறது, ரூல்ஸ் உங்களுக்கு பே ரீஃபண்ட் பண்ணிடுறோம். ஆமாம், ஏன்னா நீங்கள் நாட் ஃபாலோ த ரூல்ஸ் அண்ட் ரெகுலேஷன். ஓகே, எனக்கு அப்புறம் இதை அனுப்புங்க மேடம்.
Ladies and gentlemen,
ப்ரோக்ராமில் இருக்கு மேடம், அப்புறம் கால் பண்ணுங்க.
doctor will take the history, which means 1. Commonest being diabetes, tuberculosis, rheumatoid arthritis. These are all conditions which can affect the eye. These are all conditions, the medications of which can affect the eye. So it's very important that the patient commits to us all the details that we wish to know, and we must be very clear and have a list of details which we will ask from every patient whom we will see. The history taking is the first thing of paramount importance. Second thing is visual status, proper recording of the vision, each individual eye for distance and near. In today's world, we must remember that recording intermediate vision is probably also becoming important. Or if I may add at this point, I want to stress on every optometrist that when you do the refraction, you check for distance. When you put the near addition power, you check for near. But you all should first ask the patient, what is your profession? If your profession is something that you will sit in front of a desktop, that person expects good intermediate vision. So I want you to place the power in the trial frame based on intermediate distance and not just near distance. So do not do your work blindly, but do your work based on the need of the person who's coming to you. Second thing, needless to say, is refraction. There are good autorefractometers available today. Autorefractometers have been proven to be fairly good in their prediction or in their giving you the refraction power. But you must cross-check it with streak retinoscopy wherever there is a doubt. And you must also remember to make those corrections based on the autorefractometer which you use and not go blindly by it. If you were to do it blindly, you don't need to be an optometrist. You could just be any healthcare worker, or you could just be any person who has learned how to just click an autorefractometer and give a pair of glasses. A qualified, trained, professional optometrist will not just blindly follow the values given by a autorefractometer. I do not wish to denounce the autorefractometer. It has an important role to play today because the current autorefractometers are very good and very fast in a situation. So you can use them, but you must know how to interpret the values that you get out of an autorefractometer, and you must also know how to do a good streak retinoscopy. Very important that before you begin, after you finish your refraction, you do a good external examination. You will find facial asymmetry, you might find pupillary reaction, dissimilar interpalpebral apertures, squints, porias, tropias. You must know how to find them out. Because before you dilate, it's very important that you note down good pupillary evaluation, and because once that is done, it will mask a lot of features. Similarly, detection of cataract and glaucoma. Second and final thing is the imaging of the posterior segment by way of taking photographs for the undilated non-mydriatic camera usage, and the next level usage is the OCT. Today, OCT has probably become second most important to the slit lamp before we take a clinical decision in most clinical scenarios. So OCT is probably a very important tool today in the armamentarium of a vision care delivery service system. And then the role of the optometrist also comes very important, that you are all very deeply involved in the research, in collation of data, in interpretation of data, in publishing of papers, and in analyzing this data and correction and making changes in our preferred practice patterns. So now to the core topic which we had. So the optometrist has a huge role in vision care delivery, eye care delivery, blindness control in society. Second level is now coming specifically to the topic of cataract care. The cataract is important. Needless to say, it is the most common cause of avoidable blindness. It's probably the commonest condition in which intervention is needed in a clinic or in an eye hospital setting. So the role that an optometrist plays in that setting is crucial. Why? Because number one, in a large volume setup or in a private clinic, small volume setup, you are going to be the first line person who's going to detect the cataract. How will you detect the cataract, or when will you begin to suspect the cataract is when you see a poor glow in your streak, when the patient complains of gradual painless decrease in vision in the history, when the patient gives you history pertinent to cataract, which is gradual decrease of vision, dull feeling, blockage in vision, poor contrast, need for excess light. These are indications of cataract. Second thing is poor glow on streak. Myopic shift of refraction, very important. If you note down, the myopic shift may not be -1 to -4, but somebody who's wearing a +3.5, if they now need a +1.5, it should raise an antenna that there is probably a myopic shift. Is there a cataract? Needless to say, even after all this refraction, if there is a decrease in vision, that is a pointer that there is an evidence of some cause in the visual system which is causing a drop in vision. The very simple thing which you can immediately do is you can use distant direct ophthalmoscopy with your direct ophthalmoscopes. I'm sure most of us are used to it. which will help you screen for cataract, which will show you an opacity in the visual pathway. You could do this in a large volume setting. Next and the best level is, of course, to do a slit lamp examination. Many of you are good at it. If you are not good at it, I would advise you to all learn it. And then if you should do torchlight examination in a camp-like setting, in a large volume setting, then it will be good if you could use a loop to get better magnification and better clarity on the finding that you might have. The next question comes, now that you have done all this, if you are in a single setting where you are the only person seeing the patient in a situation like that, when would you refer it to a surgeon, or when would you suspect it is there? It is very important that even if you don't commit to the patient, you're in a clinic setting, you're in a hospital setting, the optometrist is not expected to commit to the patient that you have, because that will then change the mind of the patient. But you will know that when you're referring there, there is a possibility of cataract. So when the visual reduction is significant and cataract is thought to be the cause. Now, what question now comes is, what is the vision when you will think that cataract is significant? While we have blindness and visual impairment definitions, we do not have any specific definition when it could be significant, because it depends on the need of the patient. In today's world, if he's an educated executive working in a corporate, even a 6/9 vision causing glare while driving at night, causing strain while using the computer, causing some drop in quality of vision is very important, and the person may not tolerate it. Such a person may need to be operated upon even if he or she is 6/9. Whereas a person who does not, rural or urban, a person who does not have such activities, a very retired sedentary person, for whom probably 6/9 is good vision, and there is no posterior subcapsular cataract or cataract of such significance which causes too much glare, we can probably wait some more. So there is no cutoff to it, but there is something we will need to see with regard to the patient's importance for the quality and quantity of vision. So it's not only quantity of vision which is important today, it's also the quality of vision which is very important. That is where the concept of visual function index also comes in today's world of determining cataract and whether the cataract should be undergoing a surgery. So the visual function includes color saturation decrease, contrast decrease, light brightness saturation decrease, and quality of vision decrease by way of complaints. Too much glare when I'm driving at night, or very difficult for me to do fine print reading and writing. An artist by profession who's finding it difficult, for those persons an early cataract also needs to be intervened. Whereas a sedentary old person who doesn't have much activities, maybe an early cataract need not be advised surgery. So that is one. Then there are certain ocular factors where we will prefer to do cataract even if it may not be too advanced, which is angle closure glaucoma or angle closure patients. Because by doing the cataract surgery, we are actually opening up the angles and helping a slight drop in the intraocular pressure. This is where I bring to you a terminology called dysfunctional lens syndrome, which is something which has been coined more in the United States of America, where the surgeons feel that the early cataractous changes which brings down the quality of vision may not be as much the quantity of vision, needs to undergo surgery depending on the patient. In the entire workup and decision making. So the points to note, what will you note once your surgeon says, yes, there is cataract, or you have already suspected cataract, to help the surgeon take a decision faster? You will note the K readings. Not the spectacle power, the previous spectacle power of the patient will give you a hint whether you need to note the K readings or not, because I'll come to why the K readings have an importance in today's world. Second thing, and very important thing, you will ask a history of whether there is excess watering in the person's. You can do it with the help of a loop or a slit lamp. You must press over the sac area to see if there is regurgitation. Because if there is a suspicion of regurgitation or a block in the nasolacrimal duct, we will not do the cataract surgery. We will first need to do the lacrimal surgery before we do the cataract surgery. Very important thing then, you must note if the patient has got any medical conditions like bypass surgery done, asthmatics, epileptics, or spinal problems when they cannot lie down, which you have to highlight to bring to the attention of the surgeon, because these patients need additional care while doing the surgery. And medications such as blood thinners will need to be stopped in advance. Cardiologist clearance will be needed. Patients who are on urine flow medications called Urimax are have to be, such patients need separate set of care during the surgery. So by noting down these points, you are actually drawing the attention of the surgeon to these issues and helping them plan the surgery better. It's also very important that you must check with the patient if they have any source of infection like an ulcer in the foot, a tooth infection, an ear infection or such things, because we do not want to have a source of infection in the body when we plan the surgery. So these points are highlighted, and though the surgeon will also ask this, or the clearance physician will also ask this, you are the first line of person who raised this index of suspicion that this patient might have a dental infection, might have an ear infection, is on thinners, blood thinners. So you will need to reassess the medical condition of the patient before taking up for surgery. And then comes the next important step which the optometrists perform. And I call this the most crucial step in cataract surgery. The surgeon might do a fantastic job of performing cataract surgery, but if your biometry has gone wrong and you have placed a wrong lens in the eye, the patient is going to have a biometry surprise the next morning, going to have a huge refractive surprise the next morning, is not going to be able to see clearly, aided manner, is going to be deeply unhappy, both the surgeon and the patient, because it has been a wonderfully done surgery, and the surgeon is feeling very happy, but the patient is totally unhappy because of this. So this entirely rests on your shoulders. Do a wonderful job and assist the surgeon in this decision making of which lens to choose. In this biometry, I wish to point out that in today's world, optical biometry is considered the best biometry to do. It has its limitations. You cannot do it in dense cataracts. You must also remember that not always the K reading of the certain biometry machines is considered perfect, because it takes only of the central 2.3 millimeter of the cornea, whereas manual K is better when you incorporate it. So in many conditions, you might want to cross-check with the manual K before you give a printout to the surgeon. If the particular clinic or the eye care facility does not have optical, immersion biometry is considered as good and gives great results. So all of you must be adept at doing it. And the other thing is, contact biometry is today considered practically an obsolete procedure, because the chances of errors are very high. In today's world, we cannot have contact biometry related errors happening to our patients. So it's best to avoid doing contact biometry. And as I mentioned to you, each of this has some plus and some minus and some caution words which would be mentioned to you. Mrs. Vijayalakshmi is going to take it up and discuss with you in detail, so I will not go into the details of this. But there are a lot of little nuances that you need to learn from your seniors. Those of you who are in training and those of you who are also trained must not forget that each of this has a plus and a minus to it. Preoperative counseling today in most eye care systems are left to the counselors and not to the optometrist. But should you be a part of the team where you will also give that little boost of confidence to the patient once the surgeon has also advised this cataract surgery, you must, very important thing, that you must do it in tandem with the surgeon's decision. So that if the surgeon feels that this cataract is safer not to be done by phaco and done by the manual method, you must advise that though phaco is the better method, in that clinical scenario, manual method might give better and safer benefits to the patient. So the patient must not harp for the latest. The other thing is, each cataract has certain risk factors, like pseudoexfoliation might have higher chances of inflammation, might have zonular laxity, and so on. So there are total mature cataracts might have the chances of a drop happening. So there are various issues. Different cataracts might have non-dilating pupils, might need hooks. So these are additional counseling things. After the surgeon has mentioned in their notes, you could tell the patient, give them the confidence that yes, they must go through, but also caution them that there might be certain issues. However, your team in which your surgeon is very good and experienced to perform these surgeries. So by saying that counseling and bringing them to accept that there are additional issues in this situation, you are actually preparing the patient mentally and otherwise to undergo the procedure. We must remember and also mention this to every patient that cataract surgery produces more than 90% good results. But we must remember that this is a surgical procedure, and a surgical procedure has always got chances of complications and outcomes which might go beyond our planning. So the patient must understand, accept, and proceed with that. Then there is the choice of lenses. Today's world, again, after you see the surgeon's note, you must understand the differences between monofocal, where the need for toric comes. That's why I said you must note the K values, because when you note the K values, that is when the surgeon can start the dialogue for toric lenses. Toric lenses today give excellent results. It's very important that the patient understands what benefit they'll get with the toric lens, what benefit or plus and minus of toric versus monofocal, and between the two, what benefits they will get if they have a multifocal or a trifocal, because there might be many patients who wish to be spectacle independent after the cataract surgery, and in today's world that is highly possible that a patient can be spectacle independent post-surgical procedure. So once you understand the nuances of this with the surgeon whom you work with or are going to be as a part of a team, you can also be a part of the entire counseling. Post-operatively, oftentimes we leave it to the optometrist to take care, because we want the optometrist to understand the most important key things that you will look at in the eyes which have been operated. Again, after understanding the protocols that your surgeon places, each one has their own little likes and dislikes based on the scientific literature. So the important things that you will look for in the immediate post-operative period is that, is there a biometry surprise? If there is the biometry surprise a transient surprise, or has there been an error in calculation and we need to do a lens exchange or put in a piggyback lens or something? Very important, is there an intraocular spike? If there is corneal edema, then you have to check if there is intraocular spike, whether you should advise the surgeon to give anti-glaucoma medication. And the last and most important thing, is there patient having a severe inflammatory response, or is there a suspicion of infection? And when should you press the SOS button and bring in the ophthalmologist to take a look? Or is it a part of the normal inflammatory response and you can reassure the patient to go ahead with post-operative medication and come back for the regular follow-up? This is something, there is no one single rule to this, but these are the three key parameters you need to monitor when you see the patients post-operatively. But you must do this in tandem with the surgeons whom you work for. So with this, I wish to conclude that teamwork is needed for a patient leaving a service with satisfaction. So each of us has a role to play, that patient to go out happy with his complaints being taken care of, where the optometrists, ophthalmologists, nurses, receptionists, why even the doorman, everybody has a role to play. So it's very important that each of us understands our role, our limitations within the role, not cross those limits and try to act high and mighty, but at the same time must we really show that we are the professional who will deliver what part of the eye care service to the patient when they step in to the eye care facility. So with this, I'll end my talk. Thank you very much once again for a patient hearing. I hope to join you all live in the course of the webinar so that I can answer any questions which you might have. Thank you once again.
Okay, thank you, Dr. A.R. Okay, thank you very much for that wonderful talk. I welcome Dr. Ashok Rangarajan to the CME. Definitely, we will take up the question towards the end. I think we have the next speaker, Ms. Vijayalakshmi Arumugham, who is a senior optometrist from Shankar Nethralaya and is also faculty at the prestigious Elite School of Optometry. And she has got the experience of almost 2 decades, and she is a present key person ensuring the smooth functioning of optometry services at Shankar Nethralaya. She has wide knowledge in the field of clinical optometry and has trained many optometry students of the Elite School of Optometry and other optometrists, in which she has also faculty member for more than 15 years. She has a very key interest in the area of biometry, especially A-scan, IOL calculation, and handled many challenging cases related to biometry over a period of 10 years and more. She has given a lot of national level seminars on various topics of optometry. Her other area of expertise, clinical refraction, especially dealing with difficult cases, and so on. With this introduction, I would like to welcome Dr. Ms. Vijayalakshmi to give us talk.
Thank you, Dr. KK. And I thank Twintech Academy, Mr. Mar, for giving me this opportunity. And I'm very happy to share the space along with Aishwarya, Dr. Aishwarya and Dr. AR.
You can share your...
So moving on to my...
Yeah,
I'm going to share my presentation.
Yeah.
Presentation seen?
Not at... Yeah.
Refractive surgery. So with this note, this is an overview of my presentation. I'll be talking on these aspects. So moving on to my presentation, just to answer what is biometry, it is a method to apply mathematics to biology. So when we trace this term, it was used in 1800 for calculating life expectancy. So biometry of the eye enables the measurement of axial length, anterior chamber depth, lens thickness. So all these values put together along with the keratometry reading and proper formulas help us to achieve a precise ocular power calculation. So if we see in the last 2 decades, there has been an increased accuracy in cataract surgery. That is because of the design and standardization they have brought in the instruments. Then there are a lot of surgical refinements. Then there are refinement in the formulas. I will be discussing all this aspect in my upcoming slides. So as I mentioned, what are the variables required for effective biometry is you need to understand what is accurate corneal power. Then you need to understand actual axial length. Then you need to understand the importance of prediction of estimated lens position. Then you have to aim for a desired post-operative refraction. Then you have to understand power calculation formulas, and you have to have a very good understanding of various IOLs which are available currently. I'm not going to explain how to measure, but I'm just going to give you a few tips about keratometry and what is the importance. So as we know, keratometry is a measurement of corneal curvature, and the curvature determines the power of the cornea. So as we know, there are different types of keratometry available. You have the manual keratometer, auto keratometers are available. Then we have keratometers incorporated in the IOL, then LensStar. We can measure the curvature using topography, Pentacam, Galili. So topography uses placidus-based or elevation-based topography. Pentacam uses rotating sheen flux image. Galili uses both placido as well as rotating sheen flux. So it has an advantage. So that advantage I will be talking to you later. So coming to manual keratometry, it is still considered a gold standard for many of the biometrics. So as I said, there have been a lot of standardization in the instruments, and that has led to the accuracy of cataract surgery. So what is a standard in manual keratometry? So the standard used is you have to know what is the zone the keratometer measures. So not all keratometers measure the same zone. Some measure 2.4, some measure 2.8, some measure 3, some measure 3.2. So when the zone varies, the measurement varies. So that is the first understanding you should know. Then comes the refractive index. Previously 1.33 was used as a refractive index, then it became 1.336. Then the third is now the current standard refractive index is 1.3375. So any instrument which has a refractive index of 1.3375 is considered to be a standard instrument in terms of keratometry. Why all this we need to know is one diopter error could lead to one diopter error post-operatively. So moving on to the lens tab, we have the non-contact method, so which gives us a keratometer value also. So here this measures two zone. You have 1.31, this is 1.65 millimeter and this is 2.3 millimeter zone. So here 32 lights are projected. So 16 and 16 lights are projected. So based on that, you get to measure the curvature of the cornea. So this lens tab has an optional T-cone also that gives you a corneal topo of 6 millimeter. So IOL Master also gives a keratometry. So IOL Master 700 has an advantage. It measures anterior cornea, posterior cornea. So you get the total corneal power. So the measuring zone is 2.5 and 3.5. Yeah, we have the topographies. Yeah, topography maps the whole cornea. It identifies any corneal regularities which are available. So more dots, more connectivity, and you can think the reading can be more precise. But it doesn't happen with astigmatism because the axis will not be, proper from when you move from the center to periphery. So it will be 2 millimeter. At 2 millimeter, it is 20 degrees. At 5 millimeter, when you come down, it is 18 degrees. And 7 millimeter, it is 12 degrees. So what are the tips for accurate corneal power? Take average reading, either it is contact or non-contact. Understand the normal keratometry value varies between 43 to 44 diopters. You need to calibrate and check for the accuracy of keratometry every time you use, and use a single instrument that is known to be standard. Here standard instrument means instrument which has a refractive index of 1.3375. You need to adjust. If it is going to be a manual keratometer, adjust eyepiece to bring to the focus. Okay, so if you don't adjust your eyepiece, you'll end up an error of 0.25 to 1.25 diopter easily. So again, when you use a manual keratometer, align plus Meyer instead of minus Meyer for better result. Repeat keratometry, and again you need to capture the axis. So default don't write 180 and 90. As Sir said, it is very useful for toric calculations. So axis you need to capture accurately. And even if they don't put torics, it is useful for limbal relaxation so that the cylinder power reduces. You need to repeat keratometry when it is less than 40 diopters and more than 47 diopters. Check with the patient any history of refractive surgery done, or if there is going to be any corneal ectasias. When you note a difference in the cylinder of the refraction and the keratometry value, blindly order for a topography. Defer keratometry if you have any invasive technique done on the same day, like gonioscopy, applanation tonometer. Defer keratometry ideally for a week if they are a contact lens user, but 1 week is not possible. So if it is going to be a soft lens, 1 day overnight removal is better. If it is going to be RGP lens, you can discontinue for a week's time. So now comes a confusion. More devices, more confusion. So which to select? Yes, I do agree all instruments give different measurements of the same cornea. Why? Because manual, it is two single point 90 degrees apart, measuring zone is 3 millimeter. If it is going to be IOL Master, 6 points, and the zone it measures is 2.5 millimeter. If it is going to be Lenster, 32 points, measuring zone is 2.3, 1.65. So when you're going more closer, and when the zone varies, the measurement will vary. Again, astigmatism, you have to understand, it will give you an accurate reading, but the axis may not be the same when you move from the center to periphery. Now moving on to the actual axial lens, you have the types, you have contact type and you have immersion type. Both use ultrasound as a principle. Then you have the non-contact technique, Lenster, IOL Master. We have quite a lot of instruments available in the market. A list of few is AL scan, Pentacam axial length, Aladdin, Galilei 65, IOL Master 500, Argos, then you have iStar and intraoperative aberrometry. Currently, we use Lenstar and IOL Master. So, with that knowledge, I will be talking about Lenstar and IOL Master. So, as I said, A-scan uses ultrasound as a principle. So, a thin sound beam is emitted from the transducer and of a known frequency, about 10 megahertz. So, then when it is emitted, an echo is formed from the interface and it is received by the probe. This is converted into a vertical spike arising from the base as a function of time. So the axial length is calculated based on the following formula. Distance is equal to velocity into time, and it is divided by 2 as it echoes back to the probe tip. So you have to understand the ultrasound measures from the cornea up to the internal limiting membrane. So what are the characteristics of a good scan? Many people say it is obsolete, but again, when you have non-context of limitations, when patient can't say fixate, again, you have to rely on a good A-scan machine only. So you need to understand how to pick up a good scan. So all spikes should have reached a maximum height. It should be consistent. The standard deviation should not be 0.14 millimeter. Then corneal spike is always, it is not a reference spike. It is an interface between air and the probe, so it is never considered. So anterior lens spike is the reference spike. It should be the tallest. Posterior lens spike can be 50% to 75% tall. The vitreous chamber should be clear. Then scleral and orbital mass should flow down. And the takeoff should be 90 degrees from the base so that it will be more reflecting from the base. The probe should be held perpendicular to the visual axis. You should make sure there is no fluid bridge between the cornea and the probe. The cornea should not be compressed, and it is very important to know if there is any macular pathology present before you do the procedure. Why? Because the corneal compression on an average eye, it reduces by 2.5, longer eyes 1.75, shorter eyes 3.75. Misalignment, maculopathy, all this has a solution. So we have mounted this on an old slit lamp so that you don't compress, you don't misalign, and you get proper specs. So this is, the credit goes to Chief Dr. Badrinath. So you have to use appropriate sound velocities to get accurate measurement. So when it is going to be a silicone filled eye, silicone is used as a tamponade in most of the retinal surgeries. And once the patient is posted for any cataract surgery, you have to measure the axial length of the patient. So when you use 500 centistrokes, you have to use 1040 meter per second, and 1000 centistrokes you have to use 980. And if it is going to be an aphakic filled eye, you have to use 1052 centistrokes meter per second. So this is a picture which shows the vitreous velocity not changed 1532. You can see the axial length 42.96. So with the correct change in velocity of 980, it is 29.4 cents. So if you don't change the velocity, you will end up in a wrong reading. Ultrasound has limitations because for a smaller distance, we are using to 10 megahertz to measure. So it gives you a wrong reading, and you have to understand the macula is not flat, but then to overcome all this, we can use a partial coherence interferometry. So Lenstar is a non-contact method. So one click of a button, you get all these variables. So you have to understand it measures from corneal apex to RPE. And the measurement range is 14 to 32 millimeter. IOL Master again is non-contact. IOL 700 uses Websource optical coherence tomography. It scans about 2000 scans per second. So other than axial length, you have it is able to detect lens stills, posterior polar cataract, maculopathies also. So when an optometrist or a biometrist is able to scan, they can see the full scan of the eye. And this foveal scan helps us whether the patient is fixating or not. All this in one shot you can find out. So again, the range of IOL Master is 14 to 38 millimeter. So it's not about doing with one click. You have to know the characteristics of a good scan. So you have this narrow primary maxima arising from the RP, which is considered to be a good scan. Then you have secondary maxima. So this is an ideal good scan. So what if this is peak? You have two peaks. How will you select? So if there are two peaks and this dot is onto the right side, then it is considered to be a good spike. If this dot is onto the left side, then you have to consider the patient is having some retinal pathology and you need to rule out. We had done a study using ultrasound, IOL master and Landsat. We did compare and we found the correlation coefficient is 0.994 and p-value is less than 0.00. Of course, the department is handled by all seniors, so there is no difference between, I take the pride in telling, there is no difference between a contact and a non-contact method. Considering the axial length consideration, ultrasound uses an assumed velocity of 1,555 meters per second. So when it uses an average velocity, it is okay for an average eyes. So the results are okay. But you get to have a varied value when it is going to be longer or shorter eyes. Likewise, a non-contact machine also uses an average index. So in an average eye, the results are okay, but you get to have overestimation in longer eyes. So you have to think about this. Moving on to the tips of actual axial length, you repeat when you see less than 22, greater than 25 mm. Then when you have difference of 0.3, at least use another machine if you have, or another optometrist can repeat. And repeat the readings when there is a variation in the same eye greater than 0.2 millimeter. Then when axial length does not correlate with the refraction, and if the patient is not fixating properly, the average axial length will be around 23.5 and the normal range is 22 to 24.5 millimeter. You check for any history of anisometropia, amblyopia, scleral buckling with the patient if there is going to be a difference in the values. Moving on to the next variable, as I mentioned, is accurate prediction of estimated lens position. So what is it? So estimated lens position is a position where the IOL is going to sit after surgery. It cannot be measured pre-operatively. So it is still a holy grail in IOL calculation. So, it is considered to be that holy and it is still not to be measured. So there have been prediction previously by the manufacturer in the form of A constant. So what are the factors affecting the effective lens position? Anatomical factors, you have keratometry value, axial length, limbal wide to wide, then preoperative anterior chamber depth, lens thickness, all this affects the effective lens position. Then in terms of IOL, the shape, length, flexibility, anterior angulation, material of the optic, shape and design also affects. Anterior chamber depth is one of the parameters to predict the post-operative effective lens position, but this varies because the lens is subject to variation because of the age and pathology. So that contributes to the error in effective lens position. So moving on to this next variable is decide post-operative refraction. Not necessary all the time patient has to achieve plano. Okay. Yes, we can choose aim for myopic shift in case of a monofocal, at least a minus 0.5 or minus 1. If it is going to be multifocal, you have to aim for plano and a small amount of hyperopia. If the patient is very active, you can aim for emmetropia. If the patient is sedentary, you aim for myopia. If the patient is high hyperopic, you aim for emmetropia. Only 2 diopter of anisometropia is tolerable. And when it comes to children, you can't treat them as adult because you have to understand the process of emmetropization. So you have to have a customized approach for children for IOL power calculation. In my next slide, I will be talking about a customized approach for children. Then you need to personalize A constant for ultrasound biometry separately and optical biometry separately for each surgeon. So you can't use ultrasound A constant and for optical biometry values and vice versa. So that itself will cause error.
இதை கொஞ்சம்
The
sentence
surgeon
ஆக
induced
type பண்ணி போடு.
astigmatism has to be calculated once in a year and reviewed has to be
Frame பண்ணு,
calculated
sentence
once
frame
in
பண்ணு.
2 years because of aging and tremors of the surgeon. So this is a formula for personalization of A constant. So, and as Dr. Hill says, optimizing lens constant should be a fundamental part of any cataract surgery practice. So we have to know the outcome of the surgery, why this, what you have aimed and what you have achieved should be always done for the surgeon for a particular A constant.
அது sentence form பண்ணு.
So the next topic I'm talking is the lens position. Ideally, the lens is placed in the bag. So if it is not placed in the capsular bag, it has to be moved to the sulcus or iris plane.
Very strict on this login times.
Then you have to know that you have to reduce the power. So if it is up to 7 diopter, no change. If it is 7 to 18, reduce by 0.75. 18 diopters, reduce 1.5. For a posterior chamber lens, the constant is 118. For anterior chamber lens, the A constant is 115. So you have to reduce this. You can't use the same constant and land up in error. As I said, you have to have a customized approach for children because of hematropization. Let's look into the factors affecting the calculation. So the normal eye development affects the age at which surgery is done, then the status of fellow eye, then expected compliance and patient. Expected compliances, you should have minimal error. You can't expect the child to have more error. Then patient refractive error also affects the IOL power calculation in children. So the intraocular power calculation in children depends on the axial length keratometry measurement, then amount of myopic shift, and there is something called the target refraction, which is rule of 7. I'll be talking about this. So this is from the literature, which shows the amount of myopic shift. As you see, less than 1 age, it is 6.22 diopters. So up to 18 diopters, you consider the child to be a pediatric child. Beyond that, you can give an adult power. As I said, target refraction, you have to undercorrect for the purpose of hematropization. So if the age plus the target hyperopia will give 7. So if the age is 2, you have to undercorrect 5 diopters to get 7. Why? Because if you give an adult power, the advantage initially will be hyperopia, but disadvantage is the child becomes amblyoptic. If you give emmetropic power to the child, initially will not be requiring any glasses, but as the child grows, you land up in myopia. So you have to have a customized approach for the children, considering the age and status of the fellow eye. As a child will not cooperate, the measurements can be taken under general anesthesia. So moving on to the next variable, that is the power calculation formula. So power calculation formulas are very essential to achieve predictable outcomes. So if we see these formulas have evolved as generations and now they are classified on derivation. Just to make it simple, I have just outlined few of them. So we have historical and refraction based formulas, then we have regression formulas, then we have Vergennes formula, we have artificial intelligence formula, and we have ray tracing calculations now available. So this is a tabular column which gives the formulas as well as the example. I will be dealing with this in the next slide. So historical and refraction based formula, what they did was they fixed the same power for everybody, and that fixed power was added to the patient refraction. So they landed up in 9 diopter error for everybody, for most of them. Then they came up with a regression formula that was based on the retrospective analysis of a post-operative outcome of patients who underwent cataract surgery with the lens implant. So the first generation of SRK formula and the second generation came into existence. So the Vergennes formula uses Gaussian optics. So this is a formula, this is the equation used in the formula. So all these variables are measurable except effective lens position. So even now they are trying to work on effective lens position. So they don't know where the lens is going to sit post-operatively. So that should not give error. So that is why they're working on all formulas. So based on that, the Virgin's formula is classified into 2 variable formula, 3 variable formula, 5 variable and 7 variables. All these variables are working on to calculate effective lens position. So this 2 variable formula, what did they do? They try to optimize anterior chamber depth. They predicted anterior chamber depth before surgery. Then they use retinal thickness factor without calculation. Then they use refractive index 1 instead of 1.33, instead of 1.33, they use 1.336. So the example of 2 variable formula is SRKT, Olsen and Holiday 1. And still we are using that formula. So the Virgin's 3 variable formula is similar to 2 variable, but what they did not depend on the assumption of anterior chamber depth, but they wanted real measurements of the formula. So they did not have one constant, but they had 3 constants. So LADA super formula also comes under Virgin's 3 formula. So what they did was they combined most of the accurate portions of many formulas to make it a super formula. So the LADA's formula incorporated SRKT, OFAQ, Holiday and Haigis to make a LADA super formula. So you have Virgin's 5 variable formula. So 5 variables they used to calculate the effective lens position. So Barrett 2 universal formula comes under Virgin's 5 variable formula. So the parameters used are axial length, corneal power, anterior chamber depth, lens thickness, white to white and corneal diameter. So the 7 variable formula, it is considered, Holiday 2 is considered to be very successful because of the 7 variables used to calculate the effective lens position, axial length, white to white, AC depth, previous refraction, age of the patient, lens thickness and central corneal power. Okay, moving on to artificial intelligence. They use artificial intelligence and regression analysis of very large. So they collected all large data from many hospitals to calculate the post-surgical refractive outcomes to predict the intraocular lens power. So this is currently in use. Then now we have the ray tracing calculation. They use a ray tracing to get the preoperative lens thickness and the anterior chamber depth to derive at C. So the C derivation is the fraction of postoperative. So it is a fraction of the lens thickness. So half of the lens thickness is used to determine the IOL where it is going to sit postoperatively. So of course we will have challenges of cases when we have the eyes. So all eyes are not normal. So special conditions are when you come across eyes with corneal ectasia, then post-refractive surgeries. So corneal ectasias, you have keratoconus, pellucid marginal degeneration. So the best is when you have a K-conus, when it is mild, use a Pentacam K openly because it incorporates posterior corneal curvature. Then if it is going to be advanced, a standard keratometry value is taken for IOL power calculation. Barrett Universal 2 formula works well for mild to moderate cases, and the refraction you have to aim is a myopic shift. And advanced cases, all formulas are not going to be helpful. It is going to show a hyperopic shift. Okay, refractive surgeries. Yes, we have problem in calculating post-refractive surgery. Why? Because index error, radius error and third generation formulas error. So when it comes to index, I told you the gold standard refractive index is 1.3375. But post LASIK to measure the amount according to the amount of correction, but that is not being done. And the radius error, that is because of the assumption that the instrument measures only paracentral cornea and not the central cornea. So there is an assumption by many of them. The third generation formula, I said, they predicted effective lens position using the corneal power. So post LASIK, when the corneal power is reduced, that leads to the underestimation of IOL power. So that all these 3 reasons are the primary source of error in calculating post refractive surgery. So over the years, they have developed 25 formulas for corneal curvature and estimation, and it can be classified into pre-keratometry reading, only pre-refraction, pre-history details. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into all these details. To make life easy, I will tell you. Just you need the total corneal power. If you have a Galilei analyzer, that will solve all the problem. It will give you the total corneal power. Kindly use Galilei analyzer to get the total corneal power. And although we have number of formulas and it remains time consuming to derive at IOL powers using multiple formulas, we have web-based post-refractive IOL calculators. You can easily log on to this ASCRS calculator, and whereby when you enter all these details, you will be getting a range of IOL power, and you can choose whichever is closest. We have Barrett 2K calculator also, but only disadvantage is you need to have the pre-K as well as the post-K. So when we don't have the pre-K, then this Barrett 2K calculator is not an useful tool. So moving on to the last variable, that is understanding of various intraocular lenses. As I said, presbyopia correcting lenses are divided into multifocal intraocular lenses, extended depth of focus, and accommodative IOLs. So multifocal IOL, you have more than one focal point. It helps you for a better distance vision and near vision. So multifocal lenses are further divided into diffractive and refractive lenses based on the optics. So Acros of Restore and Technis multifocal are example of diffractive multifocal. The only disadvantage is intermediate vision is not very satisfactory even though it is a multifocal IOL. So refractive intraocular, that is rhizome, consists of 5 concentric rings alternating between distance and near. So the common issue what we encounter with a refractive IOL is the distance becomes blur and you have monocular diplopia. So to overcome all this, they have come up with diffractive trifocals. So a normal trifocal has 2 base curve, 2 steps. Okay, so you have distance vision better, you have near vision at 40 and you have an intermediate distance at 80 centimeter. So which is not useful. So intermediate working distance is always preferable at 60 centimeter. So then a quadrifocal design has 3 base curve, that is 3 step, 3 focal point, 3 step height, which gives 3 add power. So you have a better distance, you have a distance vision, you have a near vision, and you have a very good intermediate vision at 60 centimeter. But when you have a 3 add, what happens is the distance vision becomes blurred. So to overcome this, PanOptix IOL has come up with a quadrifocal design, but an adjust diffractive step. So if you see this step at 120 point, it is pushed so that it redirects for a better distance vision. So PanOptix is a trifocal, but it has 4 focal point. So this 120 point helps you for a better distance vision. Better distance vision, near vision at 40, and you have a very good intermediate vision at 60 centimeter. The next one is the extended depth of focus lenses. So it is not a multifocal, but it creates an achromatic diffractive pattern. So this has an elongated single focal point and it compensates for the chromatic aberrations of the cornea. So you have a better intermediate vision. As sir said, we have toric IOL. So if the patient has a cylinder power of more than 1.5, you can advise the patient to go for torics. Otherwise, unaided vision will be very poor. So you need to take a preoperative keratometry. Then you have to consider posterior corneal astigmatism also, because we have machines to measure posterior corneal surface also. Then you take Axelin. Then you have to know the surgeon insertion location. Then previously you should have calculated surgeon induced astigmatism. So all this put together on online toric calculator, you get the IOL power. Just to align the lenses, we have limbal registration. That is, we have image guided machine systems available, Varion, Zeiss, Callisto I. All this help us for a better alignment of axis and lens. Why? Because lens stability is very important. 30 degrees of rotation, completely you lose the astigmatism correction. So what if you have a post-operative error surprise? You recheck the medical records of the pre-operative, post-operative refraction, recheck IOL constants once again and calculation, repeat keratometry and axial length measurement after 3 months, use a fellow eye to predict outcomes in the second eye. So this is an example of a patient in our hospital where we had an error because of the axis rotation. So the original axis was 125, but it had rotated to 113. Because of 13 degrees rotation, there was change of 1.6 diopter in the cylinder power. So to conclude, it is not technology. As we said, one click of button is going to give the data, yes, but you need to verify the quality of the data. You have criteria, how to choose spikes, even if it is going to be non-contact. Then regular clinical updates is very, very mandatory because there are a lot of IOS coming up and a lot of pressure coming up with the new advancement in technology. There are a lot of machines available. So you need to have clinical updates very often, and audits is very, very mandatory so that you know what you're being aimed and what you've achieved. And you have to understand different IOLs, and you have to understand prescribing guidelines for different types of IOL, and you need to have a benchmark setting at your organization. So these are my references. Any questions? And thank you. And the next will be accommodative lenses by Dr. Aishwarya.
Thank you, Dr. Vijay Lakshmi, for the wonderful talk, and it was very extensive. And definitely, I know this required a lot more time, and you could try to bring almost 6 months of syllabus into half an hour, which is, I know that it's unfair, but definitely this will trigger a lot of the audience interest in this area, which has mostly been left over to the instrument rather than to the optometrist or any other eye care professional. And thank you for your extensive talk. And we have the next.
Thank you, Dr. Kwekar.
Thank you. We have the next speaker with us, Dr. Aishwarya. I will just share. 1 minute, Aishwarya. And Dr. Aishwarya Radhakrishnan, who will be talking about accommodative IOL perspectives. And she is the alumnus of Elite School of Optometry and undergraduate and master's degree. And she did her PhD in optics, optometry and vision science from University of Madrid. At present, she is working as assistant professor, Department of Optometry, SRM Medical College and Research Center, SRM Institute of Science and Technology. She also did her postdoctoral fellow at IIT Chennai after finishing her PhD. Her areas of interest is impact of ocular optics on visual perception, visual processing and compensatory mechanism in the eye, optical instrumentation and ophthalmic design, image processing and blur compensation in human eye. She has got a lot of publications in scientific journals, and she is also at present the treasurer of our professional body OATN, Optometric Association of Tamil Nadu. She is also the recipient of several grants from both national and international things. With this small introduction, I would like to invite Dr. Aishwarya to enlighten us with an accommodative IOL.
May I start presenting, sir?
Yes, please.
And my voice is good?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, so am I still visible in the video?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I have some gestural things to show. So Thank you so much for the introduction, sir, and thanks to you for inviting me to give this talk, and Mahalingam sir for organizing this meeting. So what I will be talking about is accommodating intraocular lenses, their prospects and limitations in current day scenario. But before I go to the actual talk, I would like to provide a disclaimer. I have used a number of brand names in this presentation, but I have no commercial or financial interest, and I do not claim myself to be an expert in accommodating intraocular lenses, but my experience on these lenses come from the lab where I did my PhD. The lab is focused on developing several solutions for presbyopia, and accommodating intraocular lenses was a major part of work which was done there. So with this, I'll start my presentation. The human eye is a very impressive optical element or an optical instrument given the various defects it has, right? And the impressive aspect comes from the fact that the eye can adapt to several situations. And one of these situations is the adaptation the eye makes to focus at different distances, which is called as accommodation. And the mechanism of accommodation was the most accepted mechanism of accommodation was put forth by Helmholtz, where he suggested that the ciliary body constricts and this anterior and posterior zonules relax, which gives a sudden pressure in the capsule, making it bulge anteriorly and posteriorly. A redistribution of the material happens in the crystalline lens, thereby an increase in refractive power is achieved in the eye. And this is a quotation from the paper of Mechanism of Accommodation, where he starts the paper by saying this peculiar process whereby the eye is enabled to see distinctly at different distances is called adaptation of the eye to distance. So having said that, we know we have accommodation, but we don't really appreciate accommodation until the time it is lost. Accommodation in the eye can be lost because of several reasons. First and foremost being aging. And when it comes to aging, or we suddenly think of presbyopia. Presbyopia is the physiological age-related loss of accommodation. And on the left here, I'm showing 3 pictures of the refractive index of crystalline lens at different age groups. And as we can see, the change in the refractive index of the crystalline lens from the center to the periphery is quite high. Okay. Is quite high in a very young subject, but as the age increases, the central refraction or the central refractive index sort of takes over the entire bulk of lens. While this sort of introduces a myopic refractive index, it does not contribute anymore to accommodation, and we start looking for other options for reading at near. And cataract, which is what we see here, and the surgery for cataract like intraocular lens implantation or even aphakia can cause loss of accommodation, especially when the intraocular lens implanted is monofocal. So by monofocal, we define the lens to be focused far, as we have seen from the previous 2 presentations. And now, in the last couple of decades, we do have options for near intraocular or otherwise in patients who have lost the accommodative ability, and these are called as pseudo accommodative methods, right? These are not true accommodations. There is no true change in refractive error or the refractive power of the eye. There is only a change in the way the focus onto the retina is brought about. And one of the most commonly used ones are the extended depth of focus lenses. The extended depth of focus lenses are the lenses where we have a distance zone, which we see in blue here. That is the primary optical component or the primary power. And the power of this blue zone is sort of increased by adding a small spherical aberration in the center in both the positive and the negative direction. So unlike the refractive or the diffractive IOLs, it does not have distinctive optic zones. And we also have pharmacological means called the FOV tears, where the pupil sizes are altered and this can also
Recorded
bring about
கொடுத்துருக்காரா?
some amount of
இப்படிதான் வருதும் அவர்
extension to the
ப்ராக்ரஸ்
depth of
காமிக்கிறாரு.
focus.
ஓகே நோட்லாம்.
We have next the multifocal intraocular lenses, like we heard from Ms. Vijay Lakshmi. We have the refractive and the diffractive models. In the refractive models, we have different zones of optical focus that sort of blend into one another, and we have distinct zones of near, intermediate, and distance foci. It can be 2 or more focal points. The diffractive IOLs are slightly different compared to refractive IOLs, wherein the power change is sort of abrupt, and as we move towards the periphery, the change in the power is more frequent, so that the central region of the pupil is left for distance vision, and that probably decreases the complaint of glare or double vision, monocular diplopia in these case of intraocular lenses. And of course, we have monovision or modified monovision options for one eye, where one eye is corrected for distance and the other eye is corrected for near, and the intermediate is sort of left in the air. Okay, well, yeah, we do have a number of options like this for near, and yet we have a need for accommodating intraocular lenses. Why? Primarily because the monovision lenses, like I said, has a large zone of between far and near which is blurred, and this is only from the optical point of view. It has a big Pandora box of binocular issues, which I'm not even going to start talking about. And then we have the simultaneous vision problem, or the monocular diplopia, glare, however we term it, with the diffractive or the refractive multifocal lenses, where at any distance we don't have a single focus, we have a focused image. On top of it, we have a blurred image from other distances. So the subject always sees. So this is a picture from our instrument which is simulating this multifocality. We see the subject, his sharp image over here, and then sort of shadow over him, which is primarily because of superimposition of different foci images. So irrespective of the distance we test, irrespective of the number of optical zones which are present in the intraocular lens, what we are going to have is a sort of imagery that is closely comparable to an astigmatic lens. Rather than having multiple line images, what we are having is multiple images of different foci. So these are the problems we have with the current pseudo accommodative solutions, and that sort of emphasizes the need for accommodative intraocular lenses. So what are accommodating intraocular lenses? These are ideally crystalline intraocular lenses made of PMMA or PHEMA or any acrylic material, which when placed inside the eye behaves similar to the human eye, right? Human crystalline lens. So when there is a stimulus for accommodation, when the patient is looking at near, the accommodative triad happens. The ciliary body changes, the pupil constricts, and then the crystalline or the intraocular lens placed will bring about some form of change in power. And these intraocular lenses, for this reason, is always placed in the capsular bag. So the optic zone is in the center, and by means of haptics, the mechanical part, these intraocular lenses are attached to the capsular bag, so that the mechanism of accommodation is still retained, and only the optical aspect of the intraocular lens or the crystalline lens is changed. And I'm talking about mechanism a lot. And what is this mechanism? Well, the most commonly available current mechanism for intraocular accommodating intraocular lens is anterior movement of the intraocular lens, right? Anterior movement, hyperopic, myopic shift. So whatever is closer is brought onto the focus.
Dr. Aishwarya, can you share your presentation again, please?
Yes, sir. were we in this screen, sir? Or is it?
Yes, ma'am, it is visible.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am, it is
Yeah, it is
visible.
now. Yeah, better.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is now. Yeah, better.
Okay, and it was in this screen or from the previous slide?
You can proceed and check.
You can proceed.
Can I
Yeah,
continue?
Yeah, from
please.
here you can continue.
Okay, Supa.
Okay.
My concept.
So the mechanism is the anterior movement of the intraocular lens. About 1 mm of movement can bring about 1.5 to 2 diopters of change in refraction, which seems to be quite a good range for someone who has absolutely no accommodation and is all the time dependent on a spectacle or a contact lens. So that is one of the mechanisms. The other two mechanisms which are possibly explored currently are crystalline, an intraocular lens that can change its shape or the curvature, or an intraocular lens that can have a change in its refractive index, thereby a change in the power. So these are truly accommodating mechanisms of accommodating intraocular lenses. That is the optics aspect of it. When it comes to the haptics, the part which holds the lens to the capsular bag, we have hinged haptics and flexible haptics. So this is the hinged haptic, which is like a hook, like a hinge, and then we have flexible haptics where there is a blending of the capsule with the haptics of the crystalline lens. In the subsequent slides, I'll be showing few commonly available hinged haptics. So Tetraflex is one of the hinged haptics that is available, and probably a very successful one because of this squarish edge of the lens design. It does not cause a posterior capsular opacification as frequently. But then what studies show is this accommodating IOL brings about a change in focus by extending the depth of focus as brought about by the flexure. Okay, because the overall lens is pushed. There is a change in the shape of the lens, which introduces some amount of spherical aberration. So here again, we are actually having an increased depth of focus rather than an actual anterior movement, therefore an actual change in the refractive power. And crystal lens is also one of the most debated accommodative IOLs that I have seen. And crystal lens has looped haptics. The loop haptics helps in providing decreased resistance to the optics. The loop can take some amount of the resistance. So it provides decreased resistance to the optics, and the lens can move forward. But probably it is for this reason that the lens behaves quite unexpectedly inside the eye. So in one of our studies where the optical coherence tomography was used to study or to three-dimensionally measure in vivo the behavior of this intraocular lens, we can see here this is the original position. The top position is the original position of the intraocular lens, and the bottom position here is the intraocular the position of the intraocular lens during accommodation. So translating this into a graph, we see here the shift of intraocular lens with different accommodative demands, and as can be seen, not all the lenses or in not all the subjects the lens moves forward. In some of the subjects, or even 50% of the subjects, the lens moves backward, and even in those subjects where the lens is moving forward, it is not moving up to the 1 millimeter of expected range. So the crystal lens, like many of the hinged haptics, did not behave as expected inside the eye. And next, what we have is the accommodative IQ, 1Q in any way. So that is not a typo, that is the spelling of the lens. So these are flexible accommodative intraocular lenses, flexible type of hinge. And here the haptics is sort of blended with the capsular bag in an angulation. So the accommodative performance is brought about because of the haptic angulation. This, however, because it is directly holding on to the capsule, it caused capsular fibrosis much earlier than the other method. methods, so it wasn't very popular. A very successful, or one of the most successful optical designs of accommodative intraocular lens is a dual optic design. Here we have two portions of the lens. The anterior zone is a high plus lens, and the posterior zone is a negative lens. So with these two lenses put together, when they are pressed together, it renders the eye imetropic. So in a distant focus position, the anterior zone and the posterior zone are in contact with each other, and the eye is imetropic. Okay, but when there is a demand for accommodation at near, when the ciliary body contracts and there is a sudden pressure from the capsular bag, these two lenses move apart because the plus lens is moving forward and the minus lens is moving behind. It brings about an effective increase in the refractive power of the eye, so thereby causing a true accommodation sort of mechanism. So this is one of the most successful optical designs that can bring about a significant amount of accommodation. And a couple of commercial companies, well-established intraocular lens companies, also manufacture this kind of intraocular lens. We also have newer intraocular lenses. For example, the Appia Vision. It has the haptics connected with the capsule, and there is a hydraulic transfer of the capsular pressure. Because of the hydraulic transfer, there is no loss of the capsular pressure that the intraocular lens experiences. Therefore, the anterior movement of this lens is much more than the previous versions of the lenses. So this is a change in the haptics. And the Opera lens is a shape-changing lens. A small suggestion by this company is that the lens should be sulcus fixated rather than fixing in the capsular bag, because the capsular bag behaves differently in different subjects. Okay, so we do have these lenses, and this graph here nicely represents how these lenses behave in the eye when implanted in a normal patient. And as can be seen, comparing these lenses to a monofocal condition, a -3 defocus is a stimulus for near, right? So what we can see is there is not much improvement in the logMAR visual acuity when we compare these lenses in its monofocal condition versus the accommodation condition. So, well, we do have these crystalline lenses, but their performance is not very well established. And currently, several guidelines have been developed to measure the actual performance of these lenses. And how do we do it? We do it at standard distances. If we look at the literature on accommodating lenses, we get near response measured at 50 centimeters, near response measured at 30 centimeters, near response measured by patient satisfaction. So there is a wide range of testing methods and testing distances, based on which the performance of the lens is reported to be very good or very bad. So to standardize that, the measurement standards were set. So we have to use a standard testing distance of 40 centimeter for near and 70 centimeter for intermediate, using standardized charts, continuous vision charts like IRIS or Radner. Accommodation should be measured subjectively and objectively. On top of it, if we want to give a questionnaire, that's well and good. But if we are reporting performance of the accommodating intraocular lens, the accommodation or the amplitude of accommodation must be measured by subjective and objective means. And if there are indications of pseudo accommodation in the outcome, that should be clearly identified in the results. And it is always better to have multicentric studies or studies of long-term longitudinal duration. So yeah, with that, I'll move over to the limitations of the accommodating intraocular lenses. The accommodating intraocular lenses, like we saw, even the company reported standards have a low range of accommodations, but when it comes to the eye, the behavior is even poorer. So the range of accommodation is quite low with these intraocular lenses. And the capsular bag fibrosis is a very, very common problem. So studies show that the shrinkage and the fibrosis of the capsular bag leads to a decrease in amplitude of accommodation over a period of time. And by long term here, we mean about in about 2 years. So this is also going to be like a presbyopia, right, where these patients get an accommodative intraocular lens. For 2 years, they have a satisfactory vision at all distances. But then once the fibrosis or the shrinkage sets in, these expensive premium lenses behave just like a monocular lens, or probably even worse. And like I have emphasized in one of the designs, these lenses have unexpected movements. In addition to moving backward or moving forward, it can have decentration and distortion related issues in the retina. So all the time the retinal image quality could be degraded. And the lenses do not have a same range of accommodative performance, right? A 20 diopter lens, when it moves 1 mm forward, is going to have much less accommodation when compared to a 25 diopter intraocular lens that moves about the same amount. So the range of accommodation is again limited by the biometry of the subject, which is again not standardized. So that is another disadvantage or a limitation of the accommodative intraocular lens. And finally, because of these unexpected backward movements, the subjects can experience unexpected myopia. Some of the accommodative intraocular lenses in research are trying to address these issues. So rather than going for hinged optics or forward shift in the intraocular lens, these the researchers are now focusing on moving on to compressible lenses, where because of compression of the capsular bag, the lens actually changes its shape as well as redistributes the material within the lens. So we have a new lens which is, I think, is being tested in animal models. Then we have a fluid lens and bifluid lens, where the change in material is happening. Smart lenses and liquid crystal displays are also being tested in laboratory and in animal models, where we have these intuitive models of change in refraction with respect to change in the lens focus. So what do we have? We do have, we fairly have a range of accommodative intraocular lenses that moves forward and brings about a change in refraction. And what is currently in the make is intraocular lenses that can successively change its shape or refractive index. But then with change in the optics, we also need to have a proper change in the haptics. And photo bonding is one of the methods that is explored for this. So what is done here is, this is a piece of PMMA stained with rose bengal, and this is a piece of the capsule, a piece of the lens capsule, which is again stained with rose bengal. These two are placed together and they are irradiated with green light. So the photosensitization brings about a cross-linking of the intraocular lens material, which is this over here, with the capsule material, which is here. This is again done in animal models, and the animal models do show very good extensiometric results, showing a large range of movement of the capsular bag, and it is also standing long term. But in addition to these, we should also think of bringing about the accommodative lenses that have a larger range of accommodation, or in other words, which does not require any addition post surgery. And as with any surgery, we need to set proper patient expectation to tell them that the currently available lenses can perform very well for few years and not so well in the later years is also very, very essential. And let's hope we come with biocompatible smart IOLs where we utilize these excellent optical properties of the existing IOLs, the biomechanical property of the capsular bag, and also the electronic aspect of detecting shift change in focus. So with this, I would like to conclude that these biomechanically smart accommodating IOLs will not only help us see at near, intermediate and far, but near, far and anywhere in between. Thank you for this opportunity once again, and thank you for all those who have stayed back this late in the evening to listen to my talk. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Aishwarya. It was wonderful update on accommodative IOL, and we all know that, I don't know, maybe Dr. AR can tell, is there any possibility of near future that we do going to get accommodative IOL of the listed, whatever Aishwarya listed so far?
Yeah, good evening, Dr. KK.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have not put my video on because I'm traveling in the car and it's all dark here.
No problem.
So, one is both of you, Vijay Lakshmi and Dr. Aishwarya, excellent talks. And it was nice hearing Vijay Lakshmi after all these years. We worked together in Shankar Nethralaya. Now, coming back to your question, Dr. KK, accommodative lenses have not become popular in its practical use for all the reasons that she has already mentioned, because of the unpredictability of the amount of accommodation that the patient actually achieves by way of good near and distance vision. 1. 2 is a lot of posterior capsular opacification and capsular phimosis, thereby displacement was the second problem that was faced in some of the models. But yes, it has huge potential in the ones which are coming forward. What we need to see is only time will tell which model will work, because currently the trifocals are achieving very good results, which Vijay Lakshmi had also already mentioned. The trifocal lenses and trifocal toric lenses are addressing a lot of the refractive problems. So the accommodative lenses have to do something more to actually give good quality and consistent. Most important word I want to use here is the consistent distance, intermediate and near range of vision. So I think it's still some distance away, but it will come in about next few years.
Okay, I think you want to add, Dr. Aishwarya?
Yes, sir. I very much agree with those points. But from what we see in the labs, it's not very far away in the future. We do have, for example, this photo bonding. There is a patent for a crystalline lens, for an intraocular lens, where the intraocular lens haptic itself is made of biocompatible materials, and it is easier to, like cross-linking during intraocular lens implantation, we are going to do an irradiation, and that is showing very good prospects in porcine and rabbit eyes. So not probably in human eyes, but that is also undergoing trials. It's approved for trials, so probably not too late into the future we can see it. But like sir said,
maybe 5 years we can.
Lenses are going to have these blur, but that blur is constant, and anything which is constant we can get used to. Accommodative IOLs are not like that. Their behavior is quite unpredictable.
Okay, I think that is very useful one. I think we will just go to one more question. I think this was a question from Dr. Binayak. He was asking about, is there any non-contact A-scan machine also available? I think Vijay Lakshmi has already spoke about it. You want to reiterate, Vijay Lakshmi, ma'am?
Non-contact immersion doesn't touch the eye. Probably immersion is one of the options.
Okay. Maybe can you just enumerate what are the non-contact A-scan available?
Non-contact scans available. We have, I listed quite a few, right?
Yeah, maybe we can.
Yeah, we have Lenstar, IOL Master 500 has become obsolete, 700. ALS.
Okay.
Scan, Pentacam, AXL, then Aladdin, then we have LE65, iStar, intraoperative aberrometry. All these are available in the market. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I think all these things are available in India itself. I'm very
Yeah, it's
happy.
available in the market, but each one has its own limitations. They need to understand.
Yeah. Just we want to ask one more question related to that, because since there are different A-scan machine is there, whether this has been developed because of difficulty we face in some of the conditions like corneal opacity, keratoconus, posterior, or post-refractive surgeries, that means in terms of laser, coloboma, silicone oil. Does it mean that all these A-scan, some of things will work for some conditions, in some condition it doesn't work? It's like that, or why we do have so many machines with each one? You said there is some advantages and limitations. Can you
Yeah,
just?
there are so many machines because of the pressure, and different companies have come up with different machines. So one company comes immediately, the other company comes up with another machine. But we been having problems when we are handling coloboma eyes. So involving macula, we had quite a lot of problem. We used to do a B scan and do the calculation. Now with the advancement of Pepso's IOL Master, so that gives a more accurate value when we are dealing with coloboma eyes. And corneal opacities, we have limitation with the non-contact, so we have to depend on ultrasound machines only. Silicone oil, again, we have been having problems previously with the IOL Master 500. Now we have with 700, that also gives a fairly good reading. So all these have been overcome with the IOL Master 700. I am not marketing IOL Master 700, but with the usage I am trying to tell you.
Okay,
I think
thanks.
it's just a point here, Dr. KK, just to
Yeah.
understand that these modern machines have brought in those. They automatically adjust the speed of the ultrasound,
Oh, okay, okay.
and the frequency ranges are way higher than what we used in the older ultrasound machines.
Oh,
That is the reason the swept source today gives very good and reliable results.
okay, okay, that's great actually. Now, just another question, maybe Dr. AR can take this one. What are the indications? Because Dr. Vijayalakshmi was talking about extended depth of focus lenses, and you people are talking about multifocal, trifocal, and Aishwarya was talking about accommodative IOL. I'm just wondering, where is this fitting into extended depth of focus?
Yeah, this comes in those category of patients who have a large need for good intermediate vision.
Okay.
That is where intermediate vision is good, but the near vision is not very good. So we have to differentiate the three ranges, as I mentioned, which is there in today's work. One is distance vision, one is intermediate vision, and one is the near vision. So where the patient wants to appreciate good intermediate vision, but is willing to compromise a little bit on the near vision, or is willing to use some glasses for very fine near vision, we can use the EDOF, the extended depth of focus lenses.
Okay, okay.
So that is where those lenses come into play.
I think one of the commonest question we used to get, actually, I always refer those questions to Vijayalakshmi and ask some of the optals, because some of the known people, I think this same question will come to many of the optometrists. Which IOL is best? Especially they will not get operated here, but they will be somewhere else. They will say there are hospital has said 3 or 4. Which one is the best? I always wonder which one is the best. I always leave it to the expert to decide, or surgeon to decide. But from optometric point of view, can you advise us how to do it?
Yeah, I would simply say that if a lens was to put into my eyes, all lenses today are acrylic. All other materials have taken a back seat. Okay. Yes, PMMA is still there. PMMA lenses are still a gold standard. But if we should look at material, it is soft acrylic, which is the one material which is the best. Number 2 should be hydrophobic. Number 3 should be single piece.
Okay.
And number 4 could be zero spherical aberration.
Okay.
So these would be the 4 qualities I would look for in a lens which I am going to use and which has been in the market for long years. Okay. So one of the reasons why we sometimes prefer the imported ones is because they've been in the market for 50, 60 years. Whereas for newer companies or some of the Indian lenses which have come in have been in the market only for 10 or 20 years. So otherwise, probably the Indian lenses and the imported lenses, if the features are the same, will match, as in the quality. The next question is, so this is the 4 things you need to look at. Okay. The 5th is and the other question about multifocal or trifocal or monofocal is, if the patient does not want to be spectacle independent and is okay wearing glasses post cataract surgery, then you can as well put a monofocal lens and give them only reading glasses. The second thing which I would insist on patients, and at this point I want to reiterate the fact with the optometrist, is that when they see that there is a cylindrical power in the old glass prescription and there is a suspicion of cataract, it will be good to do a K1, K2 with the axis. And if the K1, K2 difference is more than 1.5, the patient will definitely benefit by using a toric lens.
Okay.
So toric lens is something you can actually market to the patient, saying that they will definitely benefit and they should go for it, even if there is a small cost difference. Now, beyond this, with the brands, I never really push for a brand, because that is again the choice of the surgeon who's operating.
Sure.
If you go to a car or a two-wheeler today, which one would you choose over the other? There are pluses and minuses with everything. As
Okay.
long as these features are met, I would say you could choose a lens.
Okay, thank you. I think you say the cutoff of 1.5 referring for toric will be ideal. Is it
Yes,
so?
1.25 is on the wall. Below 1 can be corrected with limbal relaxing incisions.
Okay.
But 1.5 and above, definitely regular astigmatism will benefit with toric lenses.
And you suggest that if there is a keratometer or corneal astigmatism, then it will be more appropriate to refer.
The first indication which the optometrist gets is when they see the previous glass prescription.
Okay, okay.
When they begin the work of the patient,
Okay.
and if the patient has a high cylindrical power in the glasses, that is the first hint, though that might not translate to a K value.
Okay,
Often we see a patient with a high cylindrical power in the glasses, but the K value difference is not so much. So they are not a candidate for toric.
okay.
But at least it should raise an alarm bell, and they should try to note down the K values, which will help making the decision easier.
Okay, thank you, thank you. I think Mahalingam, can we take two more questions? Is it fine?
Yes, please, now go ahead now.
Okay, I think Vijayalakshmi ma'am, you were talking about rule of 7, and you arrived at some 5 diopter. I think we are wondering what is that all about, and how you prescribe that 5 diopter in those patients, especially when the patient comes post-operatively. I think just to clarify, can you just talk about rule of 7 and
Yes, sir. So once we have aimed, so the purpose for pediatrics, you have to undercorrect. That is going to be based on the age. That is a number, so that if the age is 3, you have to undercorrect 4, and you'll end up in 7 diopter. So once the patient comes during glass appointment, you need to prescribe so that the child does not become amblyopic. So you need to prescribe those glasses when they come for glass appointment. Otherwise, the child will become amblyopic.
okay, I think that's more specific for pediatric population.
Yeah, and as a child grows, this power is going to reduce, so it can't be remaining the same refraction. That also we have to understand. So you can't have the same refraction over the years.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, sir. You want to add anything to prayer?
No, not at all.
That's
Perfect.
I think the last question to Dr. Ayer, you are talking about this in your talk on visual function index, and you said that we have to start applying it. I don't know whether it is in practice as of now. If so, can you just highlight how to bring it to the
What I was saying is there is a lot of literature on this, where the literature in the studies which they have done, they have shown that the visual acuity alone is not an indicator of good visual gain or loss of vision due to cataract. So when we talk about visual function, there are certain very clear criteria which has been described. That is how your adaptation is from light to dark and dark to light.
Okay.
How the contrast is, how the color perception is, and how your other complaints with regard to glare and vision itself is. So there are some subjective complaints and there are some objective ways of finding out. This, along with the visual acuity, comes to form a visual function index, and there is a 14 questionnaire visual function index which is described in literature, which some centers more in the West put it in place, because what they find is the visual acuity, as I mentioned, might be 6/9. Now 6/9 we would say is good vision, and why should we operate on a cataract? But they show by the visual function that there is a drop in the quality of vision.
Okay.
and thereby they find it worth operating on such a cataractus patient. So in that context, I was mentioning that
So,
noting down the visual function details are also important, though we don't use it in routine practice.
okay. I think maybe adding the contrast sensitivity function or GLAD testing as part of the routine in addition to the questionnaire of activities of daily living before and after will give a lot of
Correct. This will help in counseling to explain to the patient. These are, of course, we must aim these questions towards the patient who's a little more aware and educated.
Okay. I think that one last question, sorry, Mahalingam, I think we have seen that in some setups, hospital setup, they do check for the visual acuity immediately first day of the post-operative. What is the basis behind that one?
I would think it is gives a good indication of whether there has been, let us say, a biometry surprise. Number one. Number two, any other gross problem or a way of addressing the patient's complaint. Many patients tend to complain that they can't see anything. So that gives us an indication of if there is any, how the visual, let us put it as post-operative recovery is, and they use that as one component for post-operative recovery assessment also. But many of us, or at least I always tell my patients that should not be taken as how it happens in every cataract surgery, that the next morning they can see everything.
Okay.
So we would examine the vision also to get a fair idea of where we stand.
Yeah, I think you were also mentioning something called transient surprise when you were talking about the post-operative thing. Whether that and this one will be linked?
Yes, the transient surprise. What I have seen in actual practice is a lot of the places have a habit of clicking the AR on the first post-operative day, and then the value comes as error or a +7 and a +6 or something, which is actually an erroneous reading.
Okay.
And then that is brought forward to the surgeon to show it as probably a biometry surprise.
Okay.
So if you see that it could be because of some striate keratopathy, or because the pupil is still mid-dilated, or because there is some corneal edema that you're getting erroneous readings. So these are not actually biometry surprises.
Okay.
You just have to wait for the eye to heal and quieten down, and then you will see that the recovery is good.
Okay. Thank you very much. Is there any other question from any of the participants or any speakers? Aishwarya, you want to ask any specific question?
No, sir.
Thank you. Vicky, you want to ask any question or you want to add any points?
No, sir, done. Probably even anterior chamber depth should be examined during the final checkup. So that plays an important role. Probably the lens has moved from the back to the sulcus also we need to see. So anterior chamber depth has an important role in the refractive error during the glass appointment. Even during glass appointment, I don't recommend doing auto refractometer. I would expect them to see what is being aimed and what is being achieved. So there is always an overestimation with the auto refractometer. Thank you, Dr. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. A.R.
Thank you.
Nice talking to you after many years.
Thank you. I think since we are running out of time, and thank you for wonderful input from all the speakers. And Mahalingam sir, vote of thanks.
So now we came to the end of the session. I would like to thank and express my sincere thanks for all the three speakers. Dr. A.R. sir, his nice presentation during his driving, and A. Vijayalakshmi madam and Aishwarya. I think the topic were well covered as per the agenda, and delegates also very extremely happy. I will also like to thank the moderator and well-wisher Dr. KK. I also would like to thank all the delegates who is attending the program very patiently from beginning to the end. Thank you all. Good night. Once again, Happy New Year to all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, sir. Dr. A.R. sir, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Good night.
Thank you. I'll see you later. Thank you, Aishwarya. Thank you, Vijay. Thank you. Thank you, Mahalingam.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Bye, sir.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
bye, bye, bye.